Revenge with Ava. The first time I realized my career could vanish with a single smile was the morning I watched a man in a navy suit shake my boss's hand like they were old friends, even though his eyes didn't smile at all, not once. And when he walked past my desk, he didn't look at me like I was a person. He looked at me like I was furniture that could be moved or thrown out depending on the mood of the room. And I remember thinking, that's strange, because I had spent 7 years here turning chaos into clean spreadsheets, late nights into clean reports, half-broken promises into projects that actually shipped. And I didn't feel like furniture. I felt like the beams holding up a whole corner of the building. But beams don't get thanked. Beams just get tested until they crack. And that day the pressure started quietly, like a storm building far off the coast where the sky still looks. Innocent until it doesn't. My name is Tessa Monroe. I'm 33, and I've been the kind of woman people call reliable, the way they call a raincoat reliable. Like it's useful but not beautiful. Like it's something you hang by the door and forget about until the weather turns ugly. And at Caraway and Flint, a mid-sized construction supply company that liked to pretend it was bigger than it was, reliability was currency as long as it didn't shine too bright. As long as it didn't make anyone higher up feel small. I was the operations analyst, which meant I knew where every dollar went, why shipments arrived late, why invoices didn't match, why vendors suddenly got preferred status even when they were more expensive. And I also knew the quiet secret no one talked about. This company ran on favors, not systems. And favors always came with a hand around your throat. The man in. The Navy suit was Dane Kessler, the new CFO. And he arrived with a soft voice, perfect teeth, and the kind of calm that made other people nervous, like he'd already measured the room and decided which parts to keep. He called a meeting in the glass conference room on the top floor. The one with the skyline view, the one reserved for big announcements and bigger lies, and I sat near the end of the table with my notebook open. Because that's what I always did. Because I believed in listening first, in gathering facts, in staying steady even when the air turned sharp, and when Dane started. Talking, he didn't say anything crazy. Not at first. He talked about efficiency, restructuring, tightening controls, and modernizing processes. Words that sounded clean, words that sounded like progress. But I watched the way our CEO, Randall Pike, leaned back with his fingers laced behind, his head like he was watching a show. And I watched the way our HR director, Margot Vance, kept nodding even before Dane finished sentences. And I felt a little chill crawl up my back, because in this company nodding was never agreement. Nodding was survival. Then Dane clicked to a slide titled Accountability Initiative, and suddenly my name appeared in bold next to a list of process failures, and my stomach dropped so fast I swear I heard it hit the floor, because the failures listed were real problems, yes, but they weren't mine. They were problems I had reported for months, problems I had begged leadership to address, problems tied to approvals Randall's friends signed off on, and vendor deals Margot called strategic relationships. And now, there it was, on a shiny slide, like I was the rot in the wood, like I had been hiding the termites. I raised my hand, polite, controlled, the way you do when you don't want to look emotional in front of people who feed on it. And I said, I'm not sure I understand why this is assigned to my role. These items are either vendor side issues or approvals that sit with finance and leadership. And Dane turned his head slowly, like I'd interrupted a prayer. Then he smiled the kind of smile that looks warm until you realize it never reaches the eyes. And he said, Great point, Tessa. That's exactly why we're making changes. We need clearer ownership so nothing slips through the cracks. And the room murmured like that made sense, like it didn't just twist reality into a knot. After the meeting, Randall pulled me aside in the hallway, his cologne heavy, his voice quiet, and he said, Don't take it personally. New guy wants to make a splash. Just keep your head down and help him out. And I stared at him, at the man who had signed my promotion letter, who had called me a rock at the holiday party, and I wanted to say, a rock still breaks if you keep dropping it. But instead, I swallowed the words because I'd learned something early. In corporate life, the truth is dangerous when the wrong people are scared. That night, I stayed late, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see the numbers again with my own eyes, needed to understand what had just happened, and the office after hours always felt like a different planet. The lights buzzing, the air too cold, the windows reflecting my face back at me like a stranger, and I pulled up our vendor ledger, the one I maintained, and I filtered by the vendors tied to the failures on Dane's slide, and I felt my heartbeat pick up, because there it was, a trail that didn't. Match the story, payments made early without invoices, consulting fees to shell companies with vague descriptions, repeated rounding amounts that looked random until you lined them up and saw the pattern, and the deeper I dug, the more I realized this wasn't sloppy management. It was a system. A siphon. A quiet leak that had been happening for years. I should have logged off right then. Should have minded my business. Should have taken Randall's advice and kept my head down. But I've never been able to unsee what I see. And I grew up in a house where money was always tight, where my mother counted coins at the kitchen table and still found a way to pay the electric bill. And she used to tell me, people who steal don't just take money, they take peace. And I felt that sentence settle into my chest like a stone. Because I could feel my peace being taken in real time, I printed a few reports, not the flashy ones, the boring ones, the kind people ignore because they don't understand them, and I slid them into a manila folder and locked them in my bottom drawer, and I told myself it was just backup, just in case, just being responsible, but the truth is, I already sensed I was being framed, and a woman doesn't survive a frame-up without receipts. Over the next week, Dane started scheduling check-ins with me, always in his office with the door half closed, always with his phone face down on the desk like he didn't want a record of anything said, and he asked questions that sounded harmless but weren't. Questions like who else has access to vendor approvals, and when did you last reconcile these accounts, and do you feel confident in your documentation? Like he was building a case brick by brick, and every time I answered honestly, calmly, he nodded and smiled and typed notes, and I felt like I was signing my own confession without knowing what the final statement would say then. One Friday afternoon, Margot from HR called me into her office, and her office always smelled like vanilla candles and quiet threats, and she shut the door fully and said, "Tessa, this is uncomfortable, but we've had concerns raised about your performance and your attitude." And I blinked, because my attitude had been polite to the point of boring, and she slid a document across the desk labeled Performance Improvement Plan, and my name was at the top, and under it was a list of complaints that didn't sound like me. Complaints that sounded like a stereotype of a woman who can't handle pressure, like emotional in meetings, resistant to change, uncooperative with leadership, and I felt heat rise in my face, not because I was guilty, but because I knew exactly what this was, the first official paper cut before the knife. I asked, who raised these concerns? And Margot's eyes flicked away for half a second, and she said, multiple stakeholders, and that phrase hit me like a laugh track on a tragedy, because multiple stakeholders could mean one powerful person and two terrified people repeating his words, and I wanted to stand up and walk out, but I didn't, because leaving without a plan is how they win. I signed the paper with a note beside my signature that said signed under protest. Dispute all claims. Request evidence. And Margot's smile tightened like a belt, and she said, we'll see what we can provide, which is corporate language for we'll provide nothing. And as I walked back to my desk, I felt every eye on me, even though no one was actually looking, because shame has a way of turning. Invisible glances into spotlights. That weekend I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying the meeting slide, the pip, the smile on Dane's face, the way Randall told me not to take it personally, and I realized something that made my stomach twist. Randall wasn't clueless. He was complicit, and I wasn't just in trouble with the new CFO. I was in trouble with the whole machine. On Monday morning, I made a decision that scared me. But it also calmed me in a strange way, like stepping onto a bridge you know might sway, but at least it leads somewhere. I started building my own file, not a messy panic file, a clean file, a timeline with dates, emails, approvals, screenshots, and ledger exports. Everything tied together like a story that couldn't be dismissed as emotional, and I saved copies to a personal encrypted drive. Because if there's one thing I learned watching my mother fight through life, it's that proof is a form of protection. I didn't tell anyone, not even my closest work friend, Leah, because Leah had kids and a mortgage and fear in her eyes the moment she saw my PIP, and I refused to make her a casualty in my war. Instead, I played the role they wanted me to play. The quiet woman trying to improve, the woman who shows up early and leaves late, the woman who says absolutely and of course and happy to help. Because there is power in being underestimated, and I needed them to keep underestimating me long enough for the truth to harden into something. Sharp, then Dane escalated, as men like him always do when you don't break fast enough, and he began copying Randall on emails that questioned my work. Little jabs dressed as professionalism, Tessa. Why was this reconciliation delayed? Even when it wasn't delayed, Tessa, please confirm why this vendor was paid without proper documentation. Even when finance approved it, and every time I replied I included facts, and every time I attached previous email threads showing I had raised the issue earlier, and every time he responded, he ignored the facts and shifted the blame like a shell game. And I started to see the pattern. He wasn't trying to find the truth. He was trying to create noise, because noise makes people tired, and tired people stop fighting. 2 weeks into my PIP, Dane called me into his office again. And this time he didn't smile. He leaned forward and said, Tessa, I'm going to level with you. I think you've been covering up a lot. I think you're smart, but not smart enough to hide it forever. And my throat went dry, because accusing someone directly is a test. It's meant to make you flinch, to make you confess to something just to end the pressure. And I forced myself to breathe slowly and said, if you believe that, Dane, you should audit the approvals. The signatures will tell you exactly where decisions were made. And his eyes narrowed, and for the first time I saw a flash of irritation behind the calm mask, like I had touched a bruise. And he said, you're not in a position to advise me. And I nodded and stood up and walked out without another word, because arguing with a man who wants you scared is like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. That night I drove home in silence, hands tight on the steering wheel. The city lights blurred through the windshield because my eyes kept watering without permission. And I sat in my apartment on my couch, still wearing my work blazer, staring at the folder on my coffee table like it was a living thing. And I whispered out loud, what are you doing to me? And the answer came back quietly in my own voice. They're making you the fall guy. And the moment I admitted it, the fear turned into something colder, something steadier. And I thought of all the times I had taken the high road, all the times I had been patient, all the times I had believed hard. Work would protect me, and I realized the high road doesn't matter if someone is building a trap right under it. The next day, I did something I never thought I'd do. I requested a meeting with our external compliance hotline, the anonymous third-party service listed on the break room poster, no one reads, and I filed a report. Not with emotions, with facts, with vendor names, transaction IDs, and dates, and I kept it neutral. Because I knew if they suspected it was personal, they'd bury it. But fraud speaks a language even cowards understand. And I wanted to force the company to listen. A week later, I got an email from an external investigator requesting documentation, and my pulse jumped. Because that meant the report hadn't died on arrival. It had moved. It had landed somewhere that had to respond, and I sent a limited set of files. Enough to confirm the pattern, but not enough to reveal all I had, because I didn't trust anyone yet. Then things got worse fast, like a cornered animal thrashing, because someone higher up must have been notified, and suddenly my access to the vendor ledger was temporarily restricted, my system permissions were updated for security, and my projects were reassigned to reduce your workload during improvement, and each change was framed as support, but it felt like someone removing the oxygen from a room while telling you they're helping you breathe. Leah pulled me aside in the copy room, her voice shaking, and she whispered, "Tessa, they're saying you've been moving money," and the words hit me so hard I had to grip the counter, because hearing the lie out loud made it real in a way I wasn't ready for, and I said, "Who is they?" And she looked down and said, "Dane. And Margot." And Randall isn't stopping it, and I felt something in me snap clean, not in a loud way, in a quiet way, like a thread finally breaking after being pulled too long. That evening, I went back into my records and found the most dangerous thing of all, a set of approvals tied directly to Dane's temporary modernization project, approvals that created a new vendor category with expedited payments, approvals signed electronically from Randall's account, while Randall was allegedly in a conference, approvals that happened minutes after Dane's login, and I stared at the audit trail until my eyes burned, because it wasn't just fraud. It was sloppy arrogance, the kind of arrogance that comes from never being challenged. The next morning, I brought printed copies of the audit log to work and slid them into my drawer next to my growing file, and then I sat at my desk and waited. Because I could feel something coming, the way your skin feels the temperature drop before thunder, and right after lunch, Margot appeared at my cubicle with 2 security guards behind her like I was a criminal, and she said, "Tessa, we need you to come with us." And my heart hammered, but my voice stayed steady when I said, "For what?" And she replied, "There's been an investigation. We've found irregularities connected to your accounts." And the office went quiet in that way offices do when people pretend not to listen while hearing everything. And I stood up slowly and picked up my purse, and I said, "I want this in writing." And Margot's mouth tightened, and she said, "You'll receive documentation." And as they walked me toward the elevator, I looked at Leah's face, pale and helpless, and I forced a small nod like I was telling her it's okay, because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me collapse. In the HR conference room, they sat me down. Margot on one side, Dane on the other, Randall at the head of the table pretending to look sad, and Dane slid a stack of papers toward me. Bank transfers, vendor payments, internal approvals, all highlighted like a prosecutor's dream. And he said, "We've confirmed embezzlement. You can resign quietly today, and we won't pursue charges." And for a second the room spun, not because I believed them, but because the nerve of it was almost surreal, like being stabbed and then blamed for bleeding. And I looked at the papers, and I recognized the transactions, yes, but the approvals were forged, the vendor contacts were altered, and the email evidence had missing headers. And I realized they hadn't just framed me. They'd built a full theater production around it. Randall leaned forward and said, "Tessa, please, let's not make this harder." And something in my chest went still, the way a lake goes still when the wind stops. And I said, very calmly, "If you believe I did this, call the police. I'll wait." And Margot's eyes widened slightly, because they expected tears, begging, panic, not a woman calling their bluff. And Dane's jaw tightened, and he said, "Don't be foolish," and I replied, "Then, don't be dishonest." And I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone and placed it on the table, screen up, and I said, "I've already filed a compliance report. I've already provided documentation to an external investigator, and I have copies of audit logs that show who created the vendor category, who approved the expedited payments, And who logged in when those approvals happened? And the silence in that room turned heavy, like the air itself was listening, and Randall's face drained a shade lighter. And for the first time, he didn't look like the confident CEO. He looked like a man realizing the trap he built had teeth on both sides. Dane tried to recover with a laugh that didn't land, and he said, "You're bluffing." And I looked him in the eye and said, "Test me." And I watched his gaze flick to Randall. For a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in his control, and that crack told me everything. They hadn't expected me to fight back. Because women like me are supposed to swallow poison and call it professionalism, Margot cleared her throat and said, "Tessa, we can discuss this privately." And I cut her off, still calm, and said, "We are private. Now give me my lawyer's contact details for your legal department. Because if you escort me out today, I will treat it as retaliation, and every document I have will go to the investigator and to the State Labor Board." And my hands were shaking under the table, but my voice didn't shake. And that difference mattered, because fear is normal, but surrender is a choice. Randall stood up suddenly like he needed air, and he said, "Let's take a break." And he walked out, and Dane followed him, and Margot stayed behind with me, lips pressed tight, and she whispered, "Why are you doing this?" And I stared at her and said, "Because you tried to ruin my life." And she looked away like my words were something dirty. 10 minutes later, Randall came back alone, his voice softer, and he said, "Tessa, maybe we moved too fast. Maybe we should review the findings." And I almost laughed, because review was the word people use when they realize the lie might not hold. And I said, "You can review all you want. I'm not resigning. And I'm not signing anything." And Randall's eyes narrowed with something like anger. And he said, "You're leaving us no choice." And I leaned forward and said, "You made the choice the moment you put my name on that slide." And I stood up and I walked out of that room on my own, not escorted, not broken. And when I reached my desk, I found a cardboard box already waiting, my things half packed by someone else like I was already gone. And that sight hurt more than I expected, because it was proof they had decided my ending without my permission. And I took a breath and started packing. The rest myself, slowly, carefully, like a ritual. And as I placed my framed photo of my mom into the box, I felt a strange warmth in my chest, like she was there with me, like she was saying, "Don't let them take your peace without a price." I walked out of the building under a gray sky, box in my arms, and I didn't cry until I got to my car, and even then it wasn't a collapse, it was a release, a few tears sliding down like rain on glass. And when I wiped them away, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror and I whispered, "Okay, Tessa. Now we do this for real," because I knew the story wasn't over, not even close, and I knew karma didn't always strike like lightning. Sometimes it moves like a slow, patient tide, pulling the sand out from under an empire until the whole thing sinks, and I was done being the woman who held up their beams while they sharpened knives behind my back. Because if they wanted to bury me, they were about to learn the one thing they never bothered to check. I grew roots in the dark. And roots don't die just because you cover them with dirt. When I woke up the morning, after being forced out of that building, my body felt like it had run a marathon, while my mind never slept at all. Every muscle tight, every thought sharp. And for a few seconds I lay there staring at the ceiling of my apartment, listening to the hum of traffic outside, wondering who I was now that the title, the badge, the desk, the routine had been ripped away. Because no one tells you how much of your identity you lend to a job until it's taken from you in a cardboard box. But then my phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I saw an email notification from an unfamiliar address, with a subject line that simply read documentation follow-up. And my heart kicked hard against my ribs, because that meant the investigator was still alive, still digging, and I sat up, suddenly awake, suddenly focused, because whatever grief I was allowed to feel Would have to. Wait. The investigator's name was Paula Renwick, and she didn't waste words. She thanked me for the materials I'd already submitted, asked clarifying questions about approval hierarchies, vendor onboarding procedures, and system access changes, and she requested additional records if available. And reading her message felt like oxygen hitting my lungs after being underwater too long, because it was the first sign that someone, somewhere, wasn't swallowing the company's story whole. I replied carefully, neutrally, attaching more files, time-stamped exports, and a written explanation that read like a user manual, not a diary, because I knew the fastest way to lose credibility was to sound hurt. And as I hit send, I felt something shift inside me, like the fear was still there, but it had been given a job to do. The next few days were strange and quiet. The kind of quiet that hums. Because I no longer had emails flooding in or meetings to run to, but my mind kept replaying moments from the past 7 years with new clarity. Conversations that once felt harmless, now glowing with warning signs, jokes about creative accounting, Randall's habit of calling certain expenses, relationships, Margot's way of discouraging written complaints, and I realized how easy it is to normalize dysfunction when it pays your rent, and how hard it is to name it when you're standing inside it. On the 3rd day, Leah called me, her voice trembling, and she said, "They told everyone you resigned due to performance issues." And I closed my eyes and let the lie settle, because lies lose power when you stop being surprised by them. And I said, "I expected that." And she hesitated before adding, "But people are nervous, Tessa. Really nervous." Finance lockdown systems. Dane canceled all meetings. Randall's been in legal all day, and I felt a flicker of something close to satisfaction. Not joy, not yet, but confirmation. Because panic doesn't come from nothing. Panic comes from cracks spreading faster than people can patch them. Later that afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. And when I answered, a calm male voice said, "Miss Monroe, this is Alan Price from the State Labor Board. We received a complaint regarding potential retaliation and wrongful termination. I'd like to ask you a few questions," and I had to grip the edge of my kitchen counter because the momentum was suddenly real, no longer theoretical, and as I spoke to him, I kept my tone steady, walking him through the timeline, the PIP, the access removal, the accusation, the forced exit, and he listened without interrupting, occasionally asking me to clarify dates. And when the call ended, he said, "We'll be in touch," which wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a dismissal either. And that was enough to keep me going. That night, I opened my laptop and did something I'd been avoiding. I updated my resume, and it felt almost rebellious, like admitting the old chapter was truly closed. But as I typed out my achievements without the company logo attached, I realized something important. Something they couldn't take from me, no matter how hard they tried, and that was competence. Because skills don't evaporate when a building locks you out, and for the first time since it all started, I slept more than 4 hours in a row. A week later, Paula emailed again, this time with more urgency, asking if I had access to any communications between Dane and the shell vendors. And I hesitated, because that was the line I'd been holding back, the emails that showed coordination, not just approval. And I weighed the risk carefully, because once you hand over everything, you lose leverage, but leverage only matters if you're trying to negotiate. And I wasn't. I was trying to. Exposé, so I sent them, encrypted, with a note that simply said, "These may be relevant." And I sat back in my chair, feeling hollow and strong at the same time, like I'd finally dropped a heavy pack I'd been carrying too long. The fallout started almost immediately, though not in ways I expected. Because instead of silence or legal threats, I got a LinkedIn message from a woman named Heather Collins, a former vendor manager who'd left Caraway and Flint 2 years earlier, and her message was short but electric. I heard what happened. "You're not crazy. They did this to me too. Call me, and my hands shook as I dialed her number. Because suddenly this wasn't just my story. It was a pattern. Heather told me about inflated contracts, about being pressured to approve vendors she'd flagged as risky, about being sidelined and then pushed out when she wouldn't play along. And as she spoke, I took notes even though I didn't need to, because the act of writing made it real. And she ended the call by saying, "I'm willing to talk to anyone investigating. I'm tired of being quiet." And when we hung up, I stared at my wall and whispered, "Thank you," because courage is contagious, and I had been the first domino whether I wanted to be or not. 2 days later, the news hit the internal rumor mill, then spilled outward because someone leaked that. Caraway and Flint was under investigation for financial irregularities, and while the company issued a bland statement about routine audits, the market reacted the way it always does to uncertainty, with suspicion, and a key lender announced it was reviewing its relationship. And I watched it, all from the outside with a strange mix of relief and grief. Because I had loved parts of that company, the people who worked hard, the sense of building something tangible, and knowing it was rotting at the top didn't make the collapse easier, just necessary. My phone started ringing more often. Journalists sniffing around, recruiters suddenly interested, old colleagues texting cryptic messages like "Hope you're okay." And through it all, I stayed careful, because revenge isn't loud at first. It's methodical. It's knowing when to speak and when to let the truth speak for you. And I declined interviews politely, telling them the matter was under investigation, because the last thing I wanted was to give anyone an excuse to paint me as a disgruntled former employee chasing attention. Then one afternoon, as rain streaked down my window, Paula called me directly, and her voice was different this time, more direct, more grounded, and she said, "Tessa, I can't share details, but I want you to know your documentation was critical. We're expanding the scope," and I closed my eyes as a rush of something like vindication washed through me, because that meant they hadn't dismissed me. They hadn't buried the file. They were digging deeper, and when I asked, "Am I at risk legally?" she paused before answering. "At this time, no. Based on what we've seen, you appear to have acted appropriately." And those words loosened a knot I hadn't realized was still choking me. That night, I allowed myself a small glass of wine, sitting on my couch in sweatpants, city lights blinking outside, and I thought about how close I'd come to believing the lie they tried to sell me, how easy it would have been to resign quietly, to doubt myself, to carry their guilt like a stain, and I promised myself I would never again confuse discomfort with danger or silence with safety. The following week brought another call, this time from Alan at the Labor Board, informing me that they were formally opening a case into my termination, and that I might be asked to provide testimony. And when I hung up, I laughed out loud, a sharp, disbelieving sound that startled me, because the system that so often fails people was, in this moment, doing exactly what it was supposed to do, and that felt almost unreal. Meanwhile, Caraway and Flint began to unravel internally, and Leah fed me updates in cautious texts, telling me that Dane had taken leave, that Randall was suddenly cooperating fully, that Margot was avoiding eye contact, and canceling HR meetings. And I pictured the glass conference room, the confident smiles cracking under fluorescent lights, and I felt a grim sense of balance returning. Because empires don't fall in explosions. They fall in meetings, in audits, in whispered conversations that change tone. One evening, as I was making dinner, my phone buzzed with a notification from my bank, and for a split-second panic flared until I realized it was just my paycheck from a short-term consulting gig I'd landed through a former client who trusted me. And I stared at the number, smaller than before but honest, and I felt a quiet pride, because I was rebuilding on my own terms now, brick by brick, without favors or fear. Then, unexpectedly, an email arrived from Randall himself. Subject line Tessa, no last name, no title, and I hesitated before opening it, bracing myself. But the message was brief and oddly hollow, full of words like misunderstandings and regret and wish things had gone differently, and it ended with, I hope we can speak. And I laughed again, softer this time, because the man who once told me not to take it personally was now personalizing everything, and I didn't reply, because some conversations are only meant to happen after consequences, not before. The true turning point came a month later when Paula asked me to come in for an in-person interview, and I wore a simple black blazer. Nothing flashy, nothing apologetic, and as I sat across from a small panel of investigators and answered their questions, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Calm. Because the truth doesn't require performance, it just requires consistency. And when I left that building, I knew, deep down, that whatever happened next, the worst was over, because I had survived the part designed to break me. That evening, as the sun set low and orange over the city, my phone rang, and this time it was Heather again, her voice buzzing with disbelief as she said, "They called me too," and I smiled into the fading light, because the pattern was now undeniable. The web fully visible, and somewhere in a boardroom or a legal office, the people who thought they could bury me were realizing they'd underestimated the weight of what they'd covered up. Because dirt is heavy, and when it shifts, it doesn't just move one stone, it drags the whole structure down with it. And as I watched the skyline darken, I understood something that felt almost like peace. Revenge doesn't always look like destruction from the outside. Sometimes it looks like accountability, like standing still while the truth does the work for you. And that was only the beginning. By the time the final reckoning arrived, it didn't feel dramatic the way movies teach you to expect. There were no sirens or shouting, no single explosive moment, just a slow tightening of the air around people who had spent too long believing they were untouchable. And I felt it first on a quiet Tuesday morning when my phone lit up with 3 missed calls from Leah before I'd even finished my coffee. And when I called her back, she didn't bother with hello. She just whispered. They escorted Dane out, and for a second I couldn't speak, because even though I'd imagined that sentence 100 times, hearing it out loud felt surreal, like watching a shadow finally detach from the wall it had been hiding on. Leah told me security showed up mid-morning. Laptops were confiscated, email access cut, and Dane left the building pale and silent. Not smiling this time, not measured. Just another man realizing too late that control borrowed from lies always expires, and I hung up the phone and sat there in my kitchen, sunlight spilling across the table, feeling something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was still clenched. The news spread fast after that. Not officially at first, but fear has its own communication system, and by the end of the week, the company released a statement announcing Dane's departure, carefully avoiding words like investigation or fraud, but the absence spoke louder than any admission, because people could read between lines even if leadership pretended not to see them. Randall held a town hall that Leah described to me later in clipped messages. How he stood under the company logo and talked about values and moving forward. How his voice shook just enough to give him away. How no one asked questions because everyone was too busy counting exits. And I realized then that the man who once thought he could sacrifice me to save himself was discovering that appeasement doesn't satisfy predators. It only feeds them until there's nothing left. A few days later, Paula called me again. And this time, she didn't hedge. She didn't soften her words. She said, "We have enough to proceed." And even though she couldn't share details, I heard it in her tone, that firm finality that comes when professionals stop speculating and start acting. And when I hung up the phone, I cried, not the messy kind of crying I'd done in my car weeks earlier, but the quiet kind, tears slipping down while I stared out the window, because relief has a weight to it too, and when it finally lands, you feel it everywhere. The labor board case moved alongside the investigation, like a parallel river, and when I received the official notice, confirming they'd found evidence of retaliation and wrongful termination, I read it 3 times, just to be sure the words didn't change, because for so long my reality had been questioned that validation felt almost fragile, like it might disappear if I blinked. But it didn't. It stayed, solid and black and white, and I forwarded it to my personal email and saved it to my drive, because some habits, once learned, never leave you. Then came the call from a reporter I trusted, one Heather had recommended, someone known for following paper trails instead of chasing headlines, and after careful consideration, after consulting a lawyer, after deciding what boundaries I needed to protect my sanity, I agreed to speak on record, not as a victim, but as a witness, and sitting across from that reporter in a quiet cafe, I told the story plainly. No embellishments, no dramatics, just facts and timelines, and the simple truth of what happens when power goes unchecked. And when the article published weeks later, it didn't scream my name in bold letters. It didn't turn me into a caricature. It laid out the system, the incentives, the failures, and the human cost. And seeing it there, shared, and read and discussed, felt like watching a mirror finally held up to a room that had refused to look at itself. Caraway and Flint's stock dipped, then dipped again, lenders tightened terms, a board member resigned, then another, and Randall stepped down effective immediately, citing personal reasons, which made me laugh out loud when I read it, because men like him always discover personal reasons right after professional consequences. And when Leah texted me a photo of the empty CEO office, desk cleared, nameplate gone, I felt no triumph, just a quiet acknowledgement that gravity still works, even in corner offices. Around that time, my lawyer called with news that made my hands tremble, a settlement offer, substantial, paired with a formal statement clearing my name, and I listened carefully as he explained the terms, the non-disclosure clauses, the language, and when he asked what I wanted to do, I didn't answer right away, because for the first time in months, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. And I thought about my mother at that kitchen table, about Leah's fear, about Heather's anger, about all the people who never get this far because they're too tired or too alone. And I said, I want the truth acknowledged. And my lawyer paused before saying, we can push for that. And we did. And when the final agreement came through, it included a clear statement that the allegations against me were unfounded, that my termination was improper, and that felt like reclaiming my name from a room full of echoes. When the money hit my account, I didn't celebrate the way people imagine you should. There was no shopping spree, no dramatic toast. I paid off debt, set aside savings, donated a portion to a workplace justice nonprofit, and sat with the rest. Because security is a quiet pleasure, and I'd had enough noise. The strangest part of all was how life kept going in small, ordinary ways. Grocery runs, laundry, morning walks, even as something monumental settled into place beneath it all. And I started consulting full-time, not for one company, but for several, helping them clean up processes, build transparency, prevent the very systems that had nearly destroyed me. And every time I walked into a new office with my own terms, my own contract, I felt taller, not because I'd won, but because I wasn't bending anymore. One afternoon, months after it all began, I received an email from a junior analyst at a different company, someone I'd never met, who wrote, I read your story. I thought I was alone. I'm not anymore. And I stared at those words until my eyes blurred, because that, more than settlements or headlines, was the part that mattered. the ripple you never see when you're just trying to survive. The last time I drove past the Caraway and Flint building, I didn't stop. I didn't look up. At the glass, I just kept going, windows down, air moving through the car, because the place no longer held anything for me, not anger, not pride, not fear, and that felt like the final victory. Because revenge isn't about watching someone else fall. It's about standing up straight after they tried to break you and realizing they failed, completely and quietly. And as I moved forward into a life built on my own terms, I carried one truth with me, steady and unshakable. They tried to bury me, but they never understood the woman they were dealing with, and now their empire was a case. Study, their power a cautionary tale, and my name, my voice, my future were finally, undeniably my own.
It's funny how life can twist itself into knots, and then somehow straighten out again. Thanks for listening and being here.